One of the interesting things about going at the end of a day like this is you get the opportunity to tie together a bunch of threads that people have been talking about. One of the other fun things is when you discover that everyone's basically said the same thing, and so now there's going to be a little bit of repetition. So my challenge is to try and avoid too much repetition. And with that in mind, I'm going to start with a question. It's a slightly personal question, so I apologize in advance. How many of you have kids? Excellent, thank you. So do I. Here they are. This is a privacy-enhanced digital photograph of my kids, which I thought would be fitting. So when I fell into the software industry after university, I thought to myself, oh, well, if I ever do have kids, it'll be quite useful to be in the software industry because I'll have a sense of like what the future holds and how things are progressing, and I'll be able to help my kids with that. And yeah, hasn't worked out so well. There's a wonderful comedian, singer, songwriter called Mitch Benn. I decided not to actually play the song, but he has this nice song, the chorus of which is, and I know you can't all see it at the back, so I'll read it out. I'm going to have to learn how to play Minecraft if I ever want to talk to my children again, which those of you who have children will probably find eerily familiar. And it gets worse. So my eldest does Code Club at school. I went to pick him up the other day. He's usually very excited about it. This particular day he was morose. How was Code Club? Well, what did you do? We had to code this game. Right, excellent. And was that not fun? No, it was dreadful. Why was it dreadful? Because he had to do it in JavaScript. And I quote, "I hate JavaScript. Python is so much better." All right, good. I mean, I'm proud of him, but still, point is, the world is changing really, really quickly. I have no idea what services, what tools, on what devices, in what context, these guys are going to want to be using in 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years' time. No idea. None. If you'd have asked me 10 years ago, I'd have had a guess. No idea. There are some things, though, that I think we do know. The first is this. Consumers, citizens, enterprises, business users will continue to push us, the industry as a whole, to provide them with services that suit their needs when they want them, that are convenient, that are easy to use, that fit in with their lifestyles, however those lifestyles may change. Pretty sure about that. The second thing I'm pretty sure about is that they will continue to drive us to provide better safety, better security, better privacy when they are accessing those services. And what's more, if we don't do that, those consumers and those business users and those citizens will choose other channels. This will become a competitive issue, if it hasn't already. And the third thing is that to do those two things absolutely requires a solid foundation of interoperable, highly safe, highly secure, scalable digital identity services. So, we know we're going to have a bunch of services, and we know that lots of different constituents, small c, will be using those services from a range of different places. And it's worth pointing out that, this isn't just about browsers and mobile phones and API. We know about that stuff. Think about new kinds of devices. If we were having this conference, let's say, 8 months ago, is that roughly pre-Apple Watch? It's not far off, is it? So in the space of 8 to 12 months, we've suddenly gone from nobody uses services that are on their wrists to everybody, apart from Luddites like me, use services that's on their wrists. Wow. We're also talking about industrial applications here, industrial sensors, building controls that will use these services. Sitting underneath all of that, way down at the bottom, are a whole set of standards and regulations. Some of those are technical, some of them are good practices, some of them are vertical or industry specific, some of them are global, some of them are regional. They overlap, they don't overlap. Maybe you're in a highly regulated industry, maybe you aren't. But somewhere along the line, you will run into standards and regulations that will inform how you deliver those services. And in order to do all of that, you're going to have a set of identity services that sit in the middle. And again, I can tell you what some of those will be. We already know about some of them. We heard about some of them earlier on today. Things like attribute exchanges, things like personal data stores. And there'll be a whole host of other ones that we can't predict right now that will happen, whatever they are. Somebody was making the point earlier on about, I can't remember who it was, I apologize, but somebody was making the point earlier on about attributes and storing information about consumers and how they weren't going to charge consumers for that. At some point, one wonders whether consumers will actually get paid for that information. And suddenly there's a whole other set of services that's going to sit in here. So there's kind of a moral imperative, right, to do this and to get it right. But there's also an economic imperative. And again, we've heard lots and lots of lovely statistics. It's pretty much, pick your favorite market report time today. Mine happens to be from eMarketer.com. Top 10 countries ranked by retail e-commerce sales, because I thought that was interesting. UK comes out third in that table, but much more interesting, retail e-commerce sales as a percent of total retail sales in select countries. The UK is at the top of that chart. This is a huge, huge opportunity. And Don made the point at the very top of the day, when I was just about barely awake, having got back from San Francisco 2 nights ago, that we're ahead of the game somewhat here. How do we take advantage of that in a way that allows us to stay ahead of the game? So, the question was asked, how can we help providers of these services to innovate more quickly and at lower cost so that we can actually get these services with the right supporting identity infrastructure out to the people that actually want and need to use them? And in talking to a whole range of organizations, both in the public and the private sector over the last few months, and a number of the organizations, again, as Emma mentioned earlier, represented in the room, three things kind of emerge. The first is that there is a desire to have access to services, identity services, that can be used for testing purposes. In other words, I want to try out and see if my idea for a publicly facing service is going to work with the right identity infrastructure. How can I test that using a product or a service that I know, or at least have some degree of trust, conforms to the various best practices and standards that sit underneath that whole piece? Second thing is, great, I want to be able to use those test services, but I also need to make sure that the services I'm using don't get in the way of my ability to respond to large procurement offers, whether those are public or private sector. Third, IPR, it turns out, is important. Wow, who knew? So we have to make sure that providers that are making these services available can do so in a way that doesn't get in the way of them innovating, but does allow them to protect their investment in the intellectual property that they're developing. So, okay, not a terribly, I was going to say pretty diagram. It's not a very pretty diagram. It's a circle with some wiggly lines. Circle in the middle, test services. Around that, a whole series of effectively red lines that encapsulate those three requirements, right? We don't want to infringe intellectual property rights, we don't want to get in the way of procurement, and we don't want to use services that don't conform to the the privacy and other standards and guidelines. And we want to be able to do this in a way that is cost effective. In other words, we want to innovate faster and cheaper. Turns out that there's a reasonable weight of opinion from those that we spoke to that having a registry of services, initially one that would be self-certified, so I, Organization X, provide this service, and I'm going to tell you that yes, it conforms to these particular standards. Over time, it may be that we can build in, some formal certification as part of that. Would be a helpful thing. And it further turns out that we have a process today that supports making sure of those various requirements, that if we were to extend it a little bit, would allow us to encapsulate that registry as part of that process. So for those of you that aren't familiar with it, and I suspect everyone in the room is, this is the lovely OIX Project process as it stands. I'm not going to go through every single stage. But extending that process at various appropriate points and saying, okay, for this particular project, does it make sense for me to look at test services that are available? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But if it does, let's work out which ones I'm going to use. Let's also work out how I'm going to feed back later on in the process things that I've learned about that to help the rest of the industry move forward. Maybe, as a result of doing my project, I'm going to end up with a service, which I can then potentially add back into the registry. Helps me get to market quicker, because now I can point my customers at it and say, hey, we're in the registry, so you know that we conform to these particular things. But it also allows me to make that service available to others in the community, again, to help further the market as a whole. And this isn't just about the UK. So there's nothing to prevent this model being extended beyond the UK to encapsulate, for example, some of the European conversation that we heard earlier on, some of the iGovernment stuff that's happening out of North America that may end up coming here also. So, where are we up to in this exploration? Published the white paper. If you haven't read it, there's more detail in the white paper, self-evidently. The white paper also proposes essentially an initial project to start building this registry. And the notion would be that we do that in the context of OIXNet, where the rules are well understood and where we can apply that same process as people are developing projects. So an alpha project's proposed to try starting to build this registry out. And it's worth pointing out that that project is intended to be a real thing. In other words, if there's a conclusion by the community at the end of that initial project that, yes, this is useful and it makes sense, we've got the beginnings of the registry. We don't have to go back to the beginning and start building it all over again. So it's designed to be agile and rapid and evolve the way that service providers would need it to evolve. The white paper also contains some suggested timescales and milestones. This is always hard to predict when you're theorizing as opposed to practically laying it out. The important thing to take from this is it's not designed to be a lengthy thing. It's designed to be something that can emerge rapidly, if that is indeed the direction that the community decides it wants to go, and that can then iterate rapidly and evolve rapidly to meet the needs of the industry as we move forward. And again, I can make some intelligent guesses about what those needs are going to be 3, 6, 9, 12 months out. But beyond that, we're going to have to find out and make some adjustments to this process as we go along. So I rather enjoyed John Timpson's presentation earlier on. And it made me realize that I'd chosen quite a good quote for this nearly at the end of my slide deck slide. So for those of you, again, I know you can't see it in the back, so I'll read it out. This is a quote from Buckminster Fuller, he of the geodesic dome. And he said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." Now, I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that the amazing test component registry and process is a new model. However, I do hope that if the community does decide to go ahead with something like it, that it will help folks in this room build the services that those guys are going to need. Thank you.
We've got time for questions for Andrew. Any questions from the floor? I've plagued you with questions all afternoon. We had everyone at lunch saying, we want to have more questions. Andrew, I'll start really then. So I'd really love to hear from your perspective some of the things that most interested you today.
So I think two things. Firstly, the amount of consistency across all of the presentations. Everyone's saying the same things. We know that we need new services. We know that we need to provide them to people in ways that are more accessible, more convenient. We know that security is really, really important. We heard that multiple times. And to hear that from so many different organizations in so many different sectors, all saying the same thing, is, I think, really, really exciting and very, very important for the identity and security industry to hear that message is getting across. I think that's really, really important. And I also like the fact that we're innovating, right? So lots of really, really innovative ideas coming out. Some of them haven't been presented, but have come out in questions from the audience. And I think that's very healthy.
Great, okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Sue is let it be known that there's a lady with a question. Thank you.
Hi, Andy.
Hello.
I've got a question for you. In your opinion, what do you think needs to happen next to accelerate this?
That's a lovely question. I think that the community needs to make a decision and say, yes, this is what we need to do. Let's do it. And then we can move ahead with it very, very quickly. But it needs everyone to read that document and to go, yeah, all those things that everybody else said, pretty much we agree with. Might not be perfect, probably isn't perfect, but let's build something and try it and see where we get to. Because otherwise we're just going to spin and not get to where we need to be.
I've got a question kind of just layering on that, if I may. So it was, what needs to happen next? So if you look at our OIX members here today, what would you charge them with doing? What's your kind of call to action for individuals here today?
Collar Don.
He'll be in the bar.
Which is a cash bar, apparently. See how that goes? Yeah, I mean, come and have the conversation with Don, with others, at the board level at OIX. Let them know that, A, yes, this is something you think is the right thing to do, or if it's not, let them know that it isn't, and come up with a better suggestion. And that, I think, will help move things forward. That's what I'd suggest. And if you can't find Don, come and find me, as long as I'm still awake, although I'm now reaching like morning in San Francisco time, so I should be awake, so there's a good chance there.
Still for a few. There's another question here, please, Sue.
Hi, Simon Dean Johns from earlier. Do you get the impression there are any stakeholders missing? Distributed ledgers sort of spring to mind. We don't want to sort of leap into solutionizing, as the Americans would say, but do we get the impression there are any stakeholders who, they're the elephant in the room, or that we should have kind of in here, as it were, that perhaps aren't?
Probably. Yeah, distributed ledgers is interesting. And by extension, blockchain is interesting, although that's probably a whole nother conversation and not for now. For me, I think the more solution providers we have engaged in this conversation, the better. Because, at least in my opinion, I think the set of digital identity services that underpin that are reasonably consistent. I think there are some new ones emerging. But I think we need to understand from the people that are actually providing, the end user experience, if you will, the services out to consumers and businesses, and the IoT crowd and those guys. What do they need to provide in their solutions that then drives that digital identity requirement? So that would be my sense.
Thank you very much. Another question over here.
Mike Garcia from NIST. You mentioned a future that involves competing on privacy and security. So in economics terms, I think it's fair to say that users have very high search costs in order to determine what any given provider's level of security and privacy are. What needs to change, and how do you see it coming about that users could actually differentiate between the privacy and security offered by any given provider in order to make decisions, and thus give the incentive for those providers to compete on it?
That's a really good question. You could probably talk for an hour on that topic as well, right? So very high level, there are some, I think, obvious and immediate things. The first is, and this was referenced earlier, the privacy and consent agreements that almost everybody is forced, usually by their legal teams, to use, are completely impenetrable, and in my layperson, not a lawyer, view, utterly worthless. I mean, certainly in terms of the end user, of me using a service, I have no idea which of those things are important, which aren't. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think businesses providing services need to think very, very hard, and this is a cultural shift, and it's a difficult one. Am I providing a service for which the exchange of personal information actually has an equivalent value? And I would contend that, for example, using a public Wi-Fi hotspot, which requires me to tell the service provider things like my postal address, is not an equitable choice. Third thing, and somebody referenced this earlier but in a different context, I think we have to start helping normal human beings, as opposed to the identity idiots in this room, why this is important, and that they should and they can demand of their service providers, no, it's not acceptable that I can walk into a high street store and buy a shirt and never have to tell you anything about myself, and yet when I want to go and do the same thing online, you want to know how many cats and dogs I have. That's not fair, and I don't want to buy shirts from you anymore, or whatever it is. And I think we have to start educating. I think that's happening slowly, but I think we could probably help it to happen faster. There's probably 27 other things, Mike, but those are the ones that immediately spring to mind.